Tales of Venison Jack, Part 5. An Unexpected Engagement. Reynold was reaching the age where he thought it would be appropriate to settle down and get married. He was a busy man and had no time for socialising with the fairer sex. But when he had been out tax collecting and fighting the villagers, Ermengarde had caught his eye, and he thought that she might make a somewhat acceptable spouse. As a dutiful retainer, he of course sought his master's permission before proceeding with the wedding. Reynold was a bit nervous about broaching such a delicate subject, but he needn't have worried. Robert Sonk-Su thought the proposed nuptials an excellent idea, and in his capacity as lord of the manor offered to give the bride away should her father be reluctant to do so. And so it was that a Norman wedding party turned up at Ermengarde's front door one morning. There was Reynold, Rolf, who was acting as his best man, Martin, who had agreed to be a witness, and Robert Sonk-Su. They all looked rather intimidating, being dressed for war rather than for a celebration of love. They were accompanied by the village priest, who was garbed in a fashion more traditional for a wedding, having donned his finest vestments. Reynold explained to Ermengarde that she should put on her best dress and come with them to the church so that he could marry her. This was the first Ermengarde had heard of marrying Reynold, and she did cry a bit. But what option did she have? And, after all, Reynold was not a bad catch. Being a Norman man-at-arms was a good steady job. There would always be taxes to collect and peasants to oppress. And he was not just any old man-at-arms, but a sergeant, a position of power and responsibility. Being his wife would have a certain social status. And so Ermengarde composed herself, washed her face, put on a clean frock, and let herself be led toward the church, which stood in splendid isolation some distance from the village. Ermengarde's ablutions had taken some time, and news spread fast in Waldenham and its environs. The inhabitants were outraged that the Normans were taking such liberties with modest Saxon maidens. Many of the younger menfolk were particularly indignant. Ermengarde was widely admired, and if she was married to Reynold, those admirers would have their hopes dashed. The outcome was that although Ermengarde may have resigned herself to her fate, others were less philosophical about the matter and determined to intervene. Wilfrid, Edgar, Wide-eyed Osric, Olwyn, Erwin, Gilbert Goosefeather and Plodding Peter hastily assembled at the church to see what could be done. The wedding party made its way through the churchyard. In the van was the priest, followed by Robert and Reynold, dragging Ermengarde behind them. Rolf and Martin brought up the rear. The path to the church door passed close to a clump of trees, and in these trees lurked 3 concealed archers, being Wilfrid, Gilbert, and Peter. Meanwhile Edgar, Wide-eyed Osric, Olwyn and Erwin hid behind the church building itself. As the Normans passed by Plodding Peter, he stepped out from behind a tree and loosed an arrow at Rolf, who deftly dodged it. Martin ran back down the path, trying to find a position where he could get off a clean shot in return. And at the head of the Norman column, Gilbert and Wilfrid emerged from behind another tree, arrows nocked. But before they could draw their bows, Robert Sonk-Su put his head down and charged at them, swinging his sword at Wilfrid's head. Wilfrid ducked, and Robert's sword blade bit deeply into the bark of the tree trunk. So far all the action had been on the Normans' left, but now Edgar, Wide-eyed Osric and Erwin came running from their right, charging around the end of the church, brandishing an assortment of weaponry. Olwyn was a bit slow off the mark and trailed some distance behind. The priest blanched to see this unruly, onrushing mob bearing down on him, and sprinted down the path to the church door, where he grabbed the door knocker, repeatedly shouting, "Sanctuary! Sanctuary!" Gilbert drew and levelled his bow, and loosed an arrow at Rolf, a well-aimed arrow that bypassed Rolf's shield and embedded itself in his shoulder. Meanwhile Martin had succeeded in lining up a shot at Peter. A bolt flew from his crossbow, but Peter stepped aside, and the bolt passed harmlessly by him. Erwin was now bearing down on Reynold, threatening the Norman with a pitchfork. Reynold released his grip on Ermengarde, drew his sword, and stepped forward to close with the Saxon. Let loose, Ermengarde looked around, confused, unsure whether or which way to run. Keen to prevent the bride from bolting, and heedless of his injured shoulder, Rolf rushed forward to grab her. But before he could do so, Gilbert Goosefeather finished the job he had already started, and shot him dead. Thus died Rolf, a valiant man, even though he was a Norman dog. On the other side of the tree from Gilbert, Robert Sonk-Su and Wilfrid continued to fight it out. Robert had freed his sword from the tree trunk and chopped repeatedly at Wilfrid, who defended himself as best he could with his dagger. But an unarmoured man with a knife is not really a match for a trained and mailed swordsman fighting from behind a shield. After a couple of particularly vicious sword strokes had come uncomfortably close to him, Wilfrid ran away. Reynold was finding Erwin a tougher nut to crack, and now wide-eyed Osric joined the fray, swinging his club at the Norman. Reynold reeled backward, avoiding the blow. Edgar rushed toward Ermengarde, shouting that he had come to save her. Reynold was not having that. He threw himself at Edgar, intending to hack lumps off the presumptuous Saxon upstart. But his annoyance made him careless. He only succeeded in impaling himself on Edgar's spear. If Edgar expected that spitting her Norman suitor would cause Ermengarde to fall into his arms, he was much mistaken. She had spotted Gilbert and ran headlong toward him. He reciprocated. With the bridegroom hors de combat, Robert and Martin decided that the wedding was probably off, and headed back the way that they had come. But before doing so, Martin found time to take another shot at Peter, and had the satisfaction of seeing his bolt strike home. The villagers gathered in front of the church, and congratulated each other on a good day's work, and Ermengarde and Gilbert gazed into each other's eyes, and plighted their mutual troth.